How you doing, YouTube? This is Gunnery Sergeant 67 bringing you another YouTube video. Today's YouTube video is going to be over SHTF, long-term food storage, and starvation. Specifically, one of the only starvation studies ever to be conducted, which is the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, or the Minnesota Semi-Starvation Experiment. In my opinion, the number one prep that a prepper should get or have is the means of self-defense or personal protection. But right underneath that is the procurement of food and water. Food is so important. If you don't have the ability to get those three things when you first start out prepping, then you really shouldn't be getting anything else, in my opinion. That's how I look at it. You should have the ability to protect yourself, your family, your property, and at the same time be able to harvest small game, large game with your personal protection system of choice. Mine are firearms. Because if you have that, then you can protect everything else as well. And then food, everybody needs food, and water. Without water, within 3 to 4 days, you're dead. Without food, 3 to 4 weeks, and you're just about dead, if not completely useless. And I wanted to touch on that. I wanted to touch on how important food is. Having been in the military, specifically the Marine Corps, for 22 years, I've got the ability in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the Middle East and Africa, to sit down there and have personal experience on watching people that have minimal amount of food to eat, and their reaction towards that. And then couple that with doing my own research, specifically with this Minnesota Starvation Experiment report that we're going to go over right now. It really gives you a kind of a point of view on why you truly need to stock up as much food as you possibly can. I think hard times are coming here to the United States, and the best thing to do is get your beans, bullets, and bandages. But again, I want to focus on the food aspect, because food, when you have an individual that's starving, they're going to do just about anything to get it, especially if someone is starving and then their children are starving. Your next door neighbors can sit down there and turn on you and rob you blind, and take everything you have just to ensure that their kids don't starve. So, all right, let's kind of get into this report. The Minnesota Starvation Experiment, also known as the Minnesota Semi-Starvation Experiment, the Minnesota Starvation Recovery Experiment, and the Minnesota Starvation Study, was a clinical study performed at the University of Minnesota between November 19th, 1944 and December 20th, 1945, basically towards the end of World War II. The investigation was designed to determine the psychological and physiological effects of severe and prolonged dietary restriction and the effectiveness of dietary rehabilitation strategies. The study was developed in coordination with the Civil Public Service, CPS, of conscientious objectors and selective service system, and used 36 men selected from a pool of over 200 CPS volunteers. The study was divided into 4 phases: a 12-week baseline control phase, which basically they gave them anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 calories, and they basically fattened them up and kind of watched each individual's eating habits. They went ahead and the next phase, a 12-week baseline control phase was the first, and then a 24-week starvation phase, causing each participant to lose an average of 25% of his pre-starvation body weight, and 2 recovery phases in which various rehabilitative diets were tried. The first rehabilitative stage was restricted by eating 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day. The second rehabilitative phase was unrestricted, letting the subject eat as much as they wanted. Among the conclusions from the study was a confirmation that prolonged semi-starvation produced significant increases in depression, hysteria, and hypochondria. Most of the subjects experienced periods of severe emotional distress and depression. Participants exhibited a preoccupation with food, both during the starvation period and the rehabilitation period. Sexual interest was dramatically reduced, and the volunteers showed signs of social withdrawal and isolation. In addition to that, I'm reading from the official Minnesota Starvation Experiment papers, but I think they leave a lot of things out because it's an official report, and then it got turned into a book in 1950. But there are numerous articles out there in regards to individuals that worked that experiment: aid workers, lab workers, medical custodians, medical testers, psychologists. There was one gentleman that he put out a small kind of article, if you will, in Life, and he explained that once these gentlemen sat down there and started the starvation period, they got about a week and a half, 2 weeks into it, and it seemed like every single meal, all of these gentlemen would get into some type of verbal or physical confrontation. And these were all men that were selected. They were in good health mentally and physically, and they all worked well with others. And they all seemed to work really well in groups. And I just find it very interesting that all that changed once their diet was restricted to very, very low calorie intake. He said that in his article, he said that there was constant fighting, physical violence in the cafeteria when they would assemble for meals. They sat down there, even though all of them were volunteers. He said that they started getting very paranoid, irritable, outbursts, isolated, depressed, and they would start blaming some of the medical staff for them being there and going through this. And they're the ones who sat down there and they volunteered for this to get out of military service. At least half of them did. So I thought that was very, very intriguing. He also said that it was normal for the participants in the starvation study to pick fights, physical fights with the staff. They also had one gentleman that wound up cutting 3 of his own fingers off. He wasn't sure, the staff wasn't sure if he did it intentionally or unintentionally, but that participant lost 3 fingers. Yeah, I thought that was very, very interesting. So as far as the intricacies of the actual stages, the first stage was the control phase, which was 12 weeks. This was a standardized period when the subjects received a controlled diet of approximately 3,200 calories of food each day. The diet of the subjects who were close to their ideal weight was adjusted so as to maintain caloric balance, while the diets of the underweight and overweight individuals was adjusted so to bring them closer to their ideal weight. On average, the group ended up slightly below their ideal weight. In addition, the clinic staff and the Laboratory of Psychological Hygiene routinely conducted a series of anthropometric, psychological, and physiological tests designed to characterize the physical and mental health of each participant under normal conditions. So this was a control phase. This was the phase where they sat down and said, hey, we're going to give y'all this amount of calories, and we're going to go ahead and get a profile on each individual, their eating habits, their personalities, under ideal conditions. And then the second phase was the semi-starvation period. This was 24 weeks. During the 6-month semi-starvation period, each subject's dietary intake was immediately cut in half to about 1,560 calories per day. His meals were composed of food that were expected to typify the diet of people in Europe during the latter stages of the war, which were potatoes, rutabagas, turnips, bread, and macaroni. On July 30th, 1945, a photo published in Life magazine showed the shirtless, bony participants. So, this picture actually was very famous when it came out. And it basically showed, which is right here, this is one of the participants. Actually, these are two other participants. Men starve in Minnesota. Conscientious objectors volunteer for strict hunger tests to study Europe's food problem. And this was in Life magazine. So, to kind of give you a mental picture, if you will, of, how bad this was. Additionally, in that same article, they sat down there and did like a full picture of all the participants here. They looked all healthy, and they were all in good health, mental and physical health. So at the start of the experiment. So after that phase, you had the restricted rehabilitation period, which was additional 12 weeks. The participants were divided into 4 groups of 8 men. Each group received a strictly controlled rehabilitative diet consisting of one of 4 different caloric energy levels. In each energy level group, the men were further subdivided into subgroups receiving different regimens of protein and vitamin supplements. In this manner, the clinical staff examined various energy, protein, and vitamin strategies for re-nourishing the subjects from the condition of famine. And in the last stage was the unrestricted rehabilitation period. That was 8 weeks. For the final rehabilitation period, caloric intake and food content was unrestricted but carefully recorded and monitored. So yeah. So with all of this, the participants, they just didn't eat. They actually had to do things. One of the things that they had to do within a given week, they had to walk 22 miles within that 7 days. However, they broke it up as long as they hit their 22 miles. And then they also had to go ahead and write in a journal. Like they were told, whatever you're feeling, put it down in the journal. The more the merrier. And they utilized this and then all of the examinations and the interviews and all this to go ahead and create a in-depth report on this starvation experiment. So the results of this experiment, the preliminary pamphlets contain key results from the Minnesota Starvation Experiment were produced and used extensively by aid workers in Europe and Asia in the months that after World War II. The full report of results from the Minnesota Starvation Experiment was published 5 years later in 1950 in a 2-volume, 1,385-page text titled The Biology of Human Starvation, University of Minnesota Press. The 50-chapter work contains an extensive analysis of the physiological and psychological data collected during the study and a comprehensive literature review. 2 subjects were dismissed. Okay, so out of the 36, at the very end of it, 31 wound up going through the whole program. 2 subjects were dismissed for failing to maintain the dietary restrictions imposed during the starvation phase of the experiment. So these 2, they were explicitly talked about multiple people. How I told you earlier that they went ahead and recounted some of their experiences there, and it technically wasn't official. It wasn't in the report. It just talks about how they were they didn't finish. But these 2 individuals, multiple people that were in the life the Life article sat down there and said that they were constantly plotting on how to steal food. They both constantly assaulted some of the medical staff because they were being paranoid that they were restricting their food intake even more than what it was. They were getting violent with other participants, and they were also cheating. They were stealing food, so they decided to kick them out. And two others of the participants, they couldn't continue because of medical issues. They wound up, their body couldn't handle it, so they had to be disqualified and taken out of the program. Among the conclusions from the study was the confirmation that prolonged semi-starvation produces significant increases in depression, hysteria, and hypochondria, as measured using the Minnesota Multi-Phase Personality Inventory. Most of the subjects experienced a period of severe emotional distress and depression, anxiety, agitation, and some violence. The rehab phase proved to be psychologically the hardest phase for most of the men, with extreme effects including self-mutilation for one subject. One of the participants, Sam Legg, this is the gentleman I was talking about, amputated 3 fingers of his hand with an axe, though the subject was unsure if he had done it intentionally or unintentionally. Participants exhibited a preoccupation with food both during the starvation period and the rehabilitation phase. Sexual interest was drastically reduced, and the volunteers showed signs of social withdrawal and isolation. The participants reported a decline in concentration, comprehension, and judgment capabilities. Although the standardized tests administered show no actual signs of diminished capability or capacity, there were marked declines in physiologic or psychological processes indicating a decrease in each subject's basal metabolic rate. The energy required by the body in a state of rest reflected a reduced body temperature, respiration, and heart rate. Some of the subjects exhibited edema in their extremities, presumably due to decreased levels of plasma protein, given that the body's ability to construct key proteins like albumin is based on the available energy source. So all of these participants basically, they weren't technically starving. They were given, even when their diet was restricted, 1,560 calories. And the medical staff tried to go ahead and give them as much protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, and balance it out as best as they can. And they still wound up feeling like they were starving. And these were all men that were mentally and physically in great shape. But 1,560 calories was not enough. And then they also tacked on the normal walking, the normal work that would have had to been required during an SHTF event, like what was going on in World War II in Europe. So I thought this experiment really hit home on exactly what could potentially happen if you don't have enough food stored and bad things happen. You have an SHTF event that cuts off our food supply and you can't go to the store and just buy more food. This is why this experiment highlights exactly why it is so important to stockpile as much food as possible, because people sit down there, and I hear it all the time, oh, I'll just run to the store. You won't be able to run to the store. Or if you do, it'll only be for a limited period of time. And after that, you are going to either have to live off of what you have stored or what you grow. And nowadays, there's not a lot of Americans that grow food anymore. So you will be susceptible to having to rely on government handouts, and you really shouldn't bank on that. But like what's right in front of you. I'm really big on freeze-dried food. It lasts for an extremely long time. It is not cheap. It's not cheap. I've had to bit and piece it together, but just from freeze-dried food alone, I've got about 3 months worth of freeze-dried food. And then on top of that, I've got some of these, normal MREs. This one in particular is a chicken burrito bowl. These don't last nearly as long, but they still last for about 4 or 5 years. Still good to stockpile them. And then I go ahead and I have numerous cans of canned food. Specifically, I love chili, stag chili, turkey ranchero. It's very calorically dense. And then also too, though, you've got to go ahead and you have to stockpile the basics: beans, rice, rolled oats. As a matter of fact, I went ahead and just recently got an order of Mylar bags that I'm going to go ahead and utilize. There's 5 of them in here. They're 5-gallon bags. I'm going to go ahead and seal up a couple of 5-gallon buckets with gamma lids and gamma seals for rice. That way, if I got to pull on this food storage, I can go ahead and also supplement it with rice and beans, and that'll bring me up to the caloric value that I need. And it will be a lot more than that 1,560 calories that these gentlemen all sat down and received during the starvation phase of the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. So, yeah, make sure you stockpile food, ladies and gentlemen, because if you think that you're going to get by on what's in your house, if you haven't stockpiled or keep going to the store during an SHTF event, you're not going to be able to. And if you haven't planned to get that 2,400 calories a day while you're doing hard work, then you're going to wind up like these gentlemen, except you're not going to be able to sit down and go to the rehabilitation phase of it. You're probably going to fall by the wayside. And what's even worse is if you have a family, they're probably going to be going with you. So go ahead and stockpile what you can. Freeze dry is not inexpensive. It's very expensive. So if you're on a budget, go ahead and stock up as much canned food as you can, and get the essentials: beans, rice, rolled oats, plain pastas. Get some Mylar bags, put them all away. That way you have something, because if not, you're going to be a refugee, and you're going to be at the mercy of the mercy and the benevolence of the federal government, or some SHTF warlord that you're going to go ahead and have to do things for to get food, and nobody wants to do that. All right, YouTube, this has gone on quite a bit, so I'll go ahead and leave it here. Please, if you like this content, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. Share with your friends and family. In the comment section, go ahead and leave me a comment. Let me know what you like, what you don't like. And tell me, just go ahead and tell me if you agree with what I've just went ahead and conveyed to everybody. If you got any questions, I'll try to answer the questions as best I can. And this is Gunnery Sergeant 67. I'm out.